we have 80 minutes, right? To do is don't publish it under your name and make money off of the presentation. We're going to talk a lot about honesty as we go through the fourth step in particular. So welcome back. We have 70 minutes, so we'll divide that up into two segments of 30 with a little break in between. So we're picked up at step 4, or we left off at step 3, and we're starting up at steps 4 and 5. In steps 4 and 5, the AA is asked to act on their intention to implement the solution. Step 1, the problem. Step 2, the solution. Step 3, the decision to implement the solution, but it's only a decision. There's an AA, I don't know what it is, a quiz. If there's 3 frogs on a log and one decides to jump, how many are on the log? The answer is 3, because it was only a decision, and that's the third step, decision. The fourth step is the first action step, and this is the act of acting on the intention that was resolved in step 3. So we jump off the log at step 4, not step 3. So here we have, hopefully, the sponsor up here pulling up the sponsee as they go up from step 3 to 4 and 5. Steps 4 and 5 work synergistically as a pair. Step 4 is introverted and private, a self-inventory, and step 5 is extroverted and public, and it is a disclosure of the self-inventory. Typically, the disclosure is made to one sponsor, or it could be a clergy person. I have heard AAs talk about fifth steps taking 8 hours. That's pretty long. As with other steps, the purpose of 4 and 5 is to clean one's house. Remember Dr. Bob was fond of saying, what do you need to recover? A, trust God, B, clean house. And so the purpose here is to clean house. But a lot of the steps are all about cleaning house. We're really starting to get into the meat and potatoes of it with 4 and 5. 4 made a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves. 5, admitted to God, admitted to ourselves, we're honest with ourselves, and we're honest with another human being, telling them the exact nature of our wrongs. I'm going to spend a lot of time talking about the exact nature. It doesn't say the general nature. Some of the vocabulary can be misleading. The word wrongs, we're going to unpack what that means. It can be misleading. But if Bill was still here, he might rewrite this to make it less confusing. I'm going to try to deconfuse it as we go through. So step 4 is introspection. Introspection for the purpose of identifying the hidden root causes of one's suffering in life. The AA asks, what causes my hostility, my alienation towards others? What causes my fears, my feelings of dis-ease? You notice the word dis-ease has a hyphen here. My feelings of dis-ease and my guilt and shame. So hostility and alienation towards others, fears, feelings of dis-ease, and then guilt and shame are inventoried. The actual mechanisms through which you do this are outlined in the recovery dynamics, and they actually have a chart with columns, and it is done very methodically on paper. The fourth step is a written inventory. It is a written inventory, and it's very structured and methodical in the big book. By the way, step 4 is introspection for the purpose of identifying the hidden root causes of one's suffering in life, not just one's drinking and all of the trouble that happens as a result of the drinking. That's only some of the suffering. This is the first half of step 1, but also now the second half of step 1 is, why is my life so unmanageable? Why is it that I have so much hostility and alienation towards others? Why is it that I have so many fears? Why is it that I feel a sense of dis-ease? Dis-ease. You know, I'm not at ease in my life. And why is it that I have so much guilt and shame? So that's the suffering. The drinking is part of it, but it's something different. So we're looking here at trying to find the hidden root causes of suffering, and these are called wrongs in step 5. You see right here the exact nature of our wrongs? What are these wrongs? These wrongs are the hidden root causes of suffering. Turns out they are dishonesty. Turns out that they are inconsideration of others. These are examples of root causes. Lack of courage, cowardice. These are the root causes that give rise to feelings of hostility and alienation, that give rise to feelings of fear, guilt, and shame. AAs who work 4 and 5 gain awareness that their own personality liabilities have created unnecessary suffering. You see, Bill used the word wrongs, the exact nature of our wrongs. I'm starting to use a different term that you might be able to resonate with and identify with. I'm using the word not wrongs, I'm using the word personality liabilities. So I think that gives you a little bit of a flavor for what it is that is creating unnecessary suffering. See the differentiation between suffering and unnecessary suffering? I felt I had to differentiate between necessary suffering, which is what step 1 is, necessary suffering, and then unnecessary suffering. This awareness enhances motivation to rid the self of these liabilities of character. A lot of this has to do with gaining motivation, willingness. This awareness enhances motivation to rid the self of these liabilities of character, and that's what happens in steps 6 and 7. Of course, 8 and 9 are also about ridding the self, letting go, disaffiliating, distancing oneself from these liabilities of character. But steps 6 and 7 will follow up shortly. 4 and 5 also makes the AA aware that their character flaws have alienated them from a sense of sacred significance. The AA literature, both 12 and 12 in the big book, don't use the term alienated them. They use the word blocked awareness of conscious contact with God, of your understanding. I just used the word alienated. I didn't use the word God, I used the word sense of sacred significance. They talk a lot about God consciousness, and I've translated that into a sense of sacred significance. Profound cosmic meaning. If I was a logotherapist, I'd use slightly different jargon. High degree of fidelity, I think, here between AA understanding and logotherapy. I'm really looking forward to Dr. Wong's talk this afternoon, the second half of this workshop. So in 4 and 5, God, according to AA, God consciousness is inhibited due to an awareness barrier created by the flaws. Now, I made up that term. I was trying to figure out how I could communicate it, and all I could say was that there is this awareness barrier. But it is created by these hidden flaws that are analyzed. These personality liabilities and flaws, aka, are also known as character defects. The AA literature is very enthusiastic about using pretty arcane terms. You have to understand these were written in the late 1930s, so we have to be able to translate into contemporary language character defects. Although now, with the resurgence of positive psychology, we're seeing a lot more jargon using the word character in there, and imperfections and deformities. And defects sounds like a fine term to me. AA's big four liabilities. What are these big four character defects? This is what all the fuss and muss are about. Dishonesty as a corrupt motive causing suffering in life and drinking. Selfishness as a corrupt motive causing suffering and drinking. Being inconsiderate. And number 4, lacking in courage or cowardice. By the way, what AA seeks to do is subtract these with the help of God, and in the process replace them with the polar opposites, so that cowardice or lack of courage, what gets put in supposedly by God, higher power, is courage. And in fact, I think if you're a follower of Martin Seligman, and past president of the American Psychological Association and chief advocate of this new positive psychology, one of his 6 virtues, he's identified 24 strengths of character, but I think one of the 6 virtues is courage. Being considerate of others is just Adler's social concern. Being honest and truthful, you find that in all spiritual traditions everywhere, not just Christianity. And selfishness being very closely aligned to being inconsiderate. I'm still trying to understand the precise difference between selfishness on the one hand and being inconsiderate on the other. I think highly overlapping, but not perfectly overlapping. And that's something I'm struggling with. So steps 4 and 5. The purpose of 4 is to identify factors that block the AA member from better consciousness of the presence of God. This is said again and again and again in the AA literature. And I kind of like the terminology they use, this idea of blocking, these ideas of barriers, because clinicians and mental health service providers, they can think, well, I could just have to remove this block. It would be very similar to a radio. If God is a signal and like a radio waves are always there, then the job of recovery is to tune the radio to receive, to get on the right channel, to get in harmony. But there are all kinds of problems with getting, because you're listening to your ego, which is telling you to lie, cheat, steal, misrepresent the truth, So you're not on the God channel, to use that kind of a metaphor. Selfishness, inconsideration, and not being truthful are seen as the exact nature of the AA wrongs. You saw in step 4 earlier, the exact nature of the wrongs? Well, here they are. Selfishness, inconsideration, not being truthful, and I forgot to add cowardice, lacking courage. These are the exact nature of AA's wrongs, and that is the root cause of their suffering. Why they're so angry and alienated from others, why they're so fearful, so much worry, why they have so much guilt and shame, and why they drink. Yes, drinking does contribute to anger at others and fear of others and guilt and shame. These character defects give rise to anger, or AAs don't use the term anger, they use the word resentment, which I think is a little bit better. It's refeeling. It is persevering anger. It is getting angry, holding a grudge and not letting it go, clasping onto that grudge. Character defects give rise to anxiety, fear, and guilt, or remorse and regret. And the remorse and regret is not just because of all the dumb things and the tragic things that people do under the influence when they're inebriated, but I think there's a little bit more existential remorse and regret for not living an authentic life. I think that's the regret that AA is seeking to address. A deep sense of inauthenticity. These forms of dis-ease, again I'm using with a hyphen, these forms of dis-ease are seen as barriers by AA to God consciousness. I didn't know what to call them, and I'm calling them anti-virtues, and they are in need of being purged. So I used a purging metaphor, and I used the word anti-virtues because there's all this talk about virtues, and what's the opposite of these virtues? And that's what AA is trying to get at. Is the problem is that these people aren't virtuous, they're the exact opposite of virtuous. And so what do you call that? I called it anti-virtue. I made that up. Somebody might have used that term, but I made it up. Step 5 involves a formalized public self-disclosure that requires honesty, requires courage, and requires humility. These are, in short, availability in AAs. It is asking them to build these virtues. They're not used to being honest. They're not used to being courageous. They're not used to being humble. They're used to being the exact opposite. So it's quite interesting how AA is actually going against their habits of thought. Steps 4 and 5 involve an intimate sharing. This is step 5 now, an intimate sharing with another person, which reinforces the self-revelations uncovered in the private inventory of step 4. So this other person receives this intimate sharing. This confidant is typically one's AA sponsor or a clergy person. And I was extremely happy to see that Joe McQuaney has written this book, Carry This Message, a guide for big book sponsorship, so that the sponsors who take a fifth step from their sponsees will know how it should be done according to the big book. And ideally, there should be a high fidelity between what happens in the fellowship and what the planned program of recovery says, because that's what got them sober back in the 30s and the 40s. And the problem these days is people are deviating, and there's a very lack of fidelity between how it ought to be and how it is. I guess you would see this in, not that AA is a religion, but you see this in other religions, right? That the spirit of the Scripture is just not being enacted. And that's what's happening these days. Step 5 involves confession of one's character defects in an effort to purify the self and make it better suited for being effective in doing God's work. And the core texts of AA, the Big Book and 12 and 12, are very explicit that that's what they're trying to do, is purify the self to make it better suited, a more effective instrument for doing God's work. The God of your understanding. Steps 4 and 5. Big Book uses the metaphor of taking a business inventory. I think this is really incredibly useful way to educate AAs. In steps 4 and 5, the AA takes stock of damaged and unwanted personal liabilities for the purpose of making space for the restocking by God, who will add virtues and strengths. So I can just metaphorically see taking a business inventory, and you go looking at the stock and trade, and you identify the damaged and unwanted items, these personal liabilities. You've got to get rid of them to make space for restocking by God, who will add the virtues or the strengths. I have a sneaking suspicion the virtues and strengths are always there. It's just that the person is alienated from them. It's not something foreign that they have to graft onto them, but this is the way it's sort of communicated in the literature. 4 and 5 ask the AA to own their character defects, which prepares the AA to grow up and take responsibility. There's a lot of talk about maturation and maturing and growing up. So this idea of owning one's character defects, I think, is really important, because when we get to step 8 and 9, these people are taking responsibility for having acted out on their dishonesty and their all the cheating and the lying and the misrepresenting of the truth and the inconsideration and all the cowardice has caused all kinds of trouble for people around them that they love. And now they have to take responsibility in step 9 and make amends to these people for the harm that they have done to them. And that's what this process starts in 4 and 5. But it's fulfilled, ultimately culminating in 9, where you make amends and you make restitution for harms done, that you have done. So the theme of owning is picked up again in step 9, where the AA is asked to make amends to others who have been harmed due to actions motivated by AA's defects of character. These hidden defects of character that are now have the light of the day being shined on them, and the AA will act on repairing the damage. So the steps 4 and 5 can be viewed, I think, as a humility induction that corrects for grandiose sense of narcissistic superiority. This grandiose sense of narcissistic superiority is what is trying to be deflated. They talk about ego deflation at depth. They like using the term ego. So if you're any psychoanalytically oriented, you just love reading this literature. But they talk about ego deflation. And that's a little bit about humility. So 4 and 5 help the AA assume responsibility for hurting others and for hurting oneself, all of the suffering, all of the fear, all of the regret, all of the remorse, all of the angers and the hostilities alienating them from others and causing them to feel that they don't belong here in the world. So they have not only harmed others, but they have harmed themselves, and their life is unmanageable. So we're talking about a process of accepting liability and fault. How many people accept liability and fault? So through 4 and 5, the AA comes to believe that they have often set in motion chains of events that resulted in harmful consequences to self and harmful consequences to others. This is a far cry from finger pointing and blaming and not seeing the 3 fingers pointing back at yourself. This is a far cry from that, which is that victim thinking. This is the opposite. This is really empowering, I think. So we're talking about owning one's hostility for others, causing this sense of alienation, owning one's fear of others, and owning one's sense of shame. So 4 and 5 increase readiness for 6 and 7. You see how they are lockstep, the dominoes. If you do them properly, according to the big book, and the experience of hundreds of thousands of AAs over the last 65 years, that they are like dominoes and they fall if you do it according to the directions given in the big book. Awareness of the damage caused by personal weaknesses, identified when taking stock in 4 and 5, is thought to facilitate the willingness needed in 6 and 7 to discard these unwanted traits. you dump them a little and discard them a little in step 5, but the step 6 and 7 is really a follow-up and a much more thorough discarding of these unwanted traits. You identified them when you took inventory, and now you're going to not hold on to them. You don't want them. You have come to the realization that they are the root of why your life has so much useless and unnecessary suffering. So you should rid yourself of them, and that's what you do in 5 and 6 and 7, of course 8 and 9 too. All right. So in 6 and 7, we're moving up to 6 and 7 because there's this phasing, this interconnectedness between 4 and 5 and 6 and 7. So in 6 and 7, AAs are asked to rely on God to help shrink and starve these traits and detach from them. I spent a lot of time writing this one sentence because I wanted to use the right words, and the best I could come up with was that in 6 and 7, the recovering alcoholic relies on God to help shrink their character defects, to help starve these character defects, and to help detach from them. Stop pouring gasoline on the fire. It'll go out if you just don't reinforce it. So we'll see how that happens in 6 and 7. So the AA is asked to abstain, not from alcohol, but to abstain from wrong thinking, wrong action, wrong words, wrong deeds. Because these are incompatible with developing the virtues that are the goal. We're going to take a break in just 2 minutes. One more slide after this. Working 4 and 5 strengthens the resolve required in 6 and 7 to let go of and disidentify with counterproductive features of the self. So you see how working 4 and 5 strengthens the resolve. What is that? We're talking about motivational readiness. Commitment. And a lot of commitment is required in 6 and 7. Because what happens in 6 and 7 is the AA is asked to let go of and disidentify with the counterproductive features of the self that have been these liabilities that have caused all of this suffering and also caused the drinking. Suffering for the self and others. I think after this we'll take just a 2-minute break instead of a 10-minute break. So 4 and 5 increase readiness for 8 and 9. If you don't like the word readiness, use willingness. Use some synonym that fits into your understanding. 4 and 5 increases readiness for 8 and 9. I said 6 and 7, that's true. We'll talk about that shortly. But we're also going to go to 8 and 9 where there's a lot of fireworks too. After 9, it's pretty well over, except 10 is the maintenance phase, and 11, of course, is implicit in all of it, and then 12 is just the outcome. I think probably 90% of the benefit comes from just 1 to 9. So steps 8 and 9 require the AA to be humble enough to want to mend broken relationships. 8 and 9. Becoming willing to make amends in 8, and 9 is actually making amends. But 8 and 9 require a lot of humility to want to mend these relationships. And where do you get this humility? Step 9 requires the AA to become contrite enough to want to make restitution to people who they've harmed in the past. I have never seen any scholars or practitioners of any sort, mental health service providers, develop any 12-step facilitations that facilitate the desire or motivational readiness to be contrite. It's not something people are highly motivated to do, but this is something that AA is asked requires the AA to become contrite enough to want to make restitution. To want to make restitution. Most people want to forget that they've harmed someone. They don't want to approach them. They want to avoid them. So people who have been victimized by an AA member, these people who have been victimized by an AA member, they appear on the AA's fourth step inventory. So you see this connection between 4 and 5 and 8 and 9. These recipients of harm also tend to be people the AA is angry at or fearful of. They name them. And these are people that they've harmed, but they are also tend to be, many of them, people that the AA member has bitter resentments against and who also they fear. And now they are asked to go to this person and make amends for what they did to harm that person and ignore why they're angry at that person and ignore why they're fearful of that person. So this really requires humility, I think. So acquiring a desire to be contrite, we need to know how to do this. AA thinks they have the answer on how to acquire a desire to be contrite, but I think that could probably be supplemented by professionals, mental health professionals. So acquiring a desire to be contrite with these people presupposes that the AA has awareness of their own culpability in perpetrating harm on these others. And that's tough because they're so self-deceived often, dishonest with themselves, they think that they have a halo and that they are perfectly innocent. So acquiring desire to be contrite presupposes an awareness that one is culpable for perpetrating harm on these others. So why else would you be contrite? So completing steps 4 and 5, according to AA literature, enhances the AA's awareness of their culpability, and thus 4 and 5 motivate involvement in the amends steps. I don't think there's any AAs that can effectively do an 8th and 9th step having skipped over 4 and 5. It just makes no logical sense. And that's why they're done in sequence. All right, summarize. I think what we'll do is we'll take just like a 2-minute break, and then we'll summarize, and then we'll carry on with the remainder after the break. Going fast, isn't it?
Yeah. I don't know if you're going to get your second pass.
No. We have to get some more time.
Yeah.
And that's where really the second time through, the comprehension and the understanding is so much. At approximately just under half an hour, I think I'm going to have to give another presentation after everybody goes home tonight to finish the second pass through these 12 steps. I didn't realize I had a 6-hour workshop. But we'll certainly get through the first 9, which are really all of the fireworks happens in 4, 5, 6, and 7, and 8 and 9. After that, you start to coast. All right. So here's a summary, just to recap where we were on steps 4 and 5. AAs who follow the Big Book directions for doing their 4th and 5th steps can expect to be more effective in working 6 and 7 and more effective in working 8 and 9. I do research in this area and I read a number of scholarly articles, and I've never seen this actually tested, that the benefits derived from 6 and 7 are going to be greater if you've done a 4th and 5th. So we have all kinds of directions for future research. This is what AA is saying. Whether it's borne out by empirical evidence, we don't know yet. Big Book suggests, for instance, that an AA can't do 8 and 9 justice without first knowing the exact nature of their wrongs. And that just makes sense, that you have to know the exact nature of their wrongs. The term exact nature, again, has less to do with the topography of the AA's hurtful actions and more to do with the underlying motives. So the exact nature really refers to the AA being engaging in words and deeds motivated by dishonesty, engaging in words and deeds motivated by selfishness, lack of courage. These are the exact nature of the wrongs. It's not, I hit you with a hammer on the head. It's why did I hit you on the head with the hammer? So it's not the topography, it's the underlying motives. And you'll only come to understand that in 4 and 5. So you can't possibly do a good job at becoming willing to make amends and making amends in 8 and 9. So let's move on to 6 and 7. These are incredibly important steps, much misunderstood. So we continue to do what we previously decided we would do. This is what the AAs are asked to do at 6 and 7. They are asked to continue to do what they previously decided they would do. And when did they make that decision? They made it during the 3rd step. So now they're going to carry on doing what they resolved that they would do in step 3. So what is 6 and 7? 6, we were entirely ready to have God remove all these defects of character. Humbly asked Him to remove our shortcomings. So we have readiness to have God remove these defects of character. And again, what are the defects of character? Dishonesty, self-seeking, cowardice. Humbly asked Him, God, higher power, to remove our shortcomings. Bill used a number of different synonyms. I can assure you from everything that I've read, everything that I've been told over the years, there is no difference between the word shortcoming and the word defects of character. They refer to the same thing. Somebody thought maybe he took an English course and that he just thought people would get bored if he used the same term. But he has caused a tremendous amount of confusion using different jargon. Same thing. I call them personality liabilities. I mean, I've called them all kinds of things, haven't I? 6 and 7 seek to increase an A's spiritual resolve and commitment. 6 and 7 seek to increase an A's spiritual resolve. What is spiritual resolve and commitment? The goal is to gain willingness to become motivationally ready. You can actually see the word ready right here. The goal is to gain willingness and to become motivationally ready. You see a theme here. I mean, all of this is talking about readiness and motivational. If anybody here is into brief motivational enhancement, a la Bill Miller, I mean, you have to see all these red flags flying. AA is asked to resolve to let go of personal liabilities that have motivated harmful actions to self and others. These personal liabilities were identified in step 4. They were talked about or confessed in step 5. But they're in the inventory, but you've got to get rid of them now. So there's a resolve to let go of these personal liabilities that have motivated harmful actions to self and others and cause all this unnecessary suffering to self, all this unnecessary suffering to others, and that have caused the alcohol drinking problem. All right. So step 6 adds to 4 and 5 to further show these liabilities have blocked the AA from having conscious awareness of God's presence. As long as these liabilities stay on the shelves when you've taken your business inventory, you're going to be having difficulty having conscious awareness of God's presence. And you're going to be listening to your own ego, which has always steered you wrong. So we have to get rid of these blocks or barriers. So 6 and 7 facilitate a willingness or desire to stop having one's life be controlled, dominated, and victimized by one's character flaws. Stop being the director and let God be the director. So 6 and 7. They encourage a desire to purify one's character in order to be able to live a life motivated by godly virtues rather than human flaws. So I'm pitting the godly virtues on the one side and the human flaws on the other side. They're really not necessarily godly virtues, but you could think of them as the higher self if you have an Eastern philosophical orientation. So, we're talking about replacing old motives of deceit, selfishness, and cowardice with new motives of truthfulness, concern for others, and courage. That's what 6 and 7 are about. Of course, that's what the whole program is about. All these steps seem to be doing the same thing, huh? But it's a gentle process, step-by-step nudging. Motivational readiness to let go of personal liabilities that have prevented the self from knowing God's will and being able to carry it out. To let go of personal liabilities that have prevented the self from knowing God's will. Now I'm starting to sound redundant, but you get the idea of what's happening in AA. 6 and 7 are just extensions of the third step decision. They are action steps that pick up and follow through. I promise to pursue that solution. And now this is evidence that you are making good on your promise when you do 6 and 7. So in step 3, the AA gave consent to be controlled by God instead of corrupt motives or flawed traits. That consent was given. But again, it's the frogs on the log. One makes a decision to jump. How many are there? They're all still there. It's just a decision. 6 and 7, you're jumping. Concerned with neutralizing or eliminating self-will. We just had a discussion here about, is self-will ever really eliminated? In AA literature, it suggests it can be eliminated. They use metaphors of ripping it out by the root. That would suggest that it's eliminated. Well, that's why I put the word neutralized in there. I think it's just sort of in check. As long as you're spiritually fit, it's in check. It's like if you're a diabetic and you're doing the right thing with your medicine, it's in check. But as soon as you stop trudging the happy road to destiny, then the diabetes symptoms come back, the alcoholism symptoms come back. And it's the ism that's the problem in alcoholism, right? You've heard that. The word alcoholism, ISM, is at the end. Get rid of those three. What's left? Alcohol. Problem is not the alcohol, really. The problem is the ism. It's the I, the self, and the me. And that's what AA is all about. It's about addressing the ism. You hear that term. Certainly most scholars are not aware of that. Okay, 6 and 7. The appeal to God in step 7, acknowledges the selfish ego can't use volition to become altruistic, and the dishonest ego can't will itself to value the truth. You see the paradox here. The appeal to God in step 7 acknowledges that the selfish ego can't use volition to become altruistic, and the dishonest ego can't will itself to value the truth. Because one is the antithesis of the other. How can a cup that's, well, we won't get it. We don't have time for that. 7 explicitly involves prayer. You see in step 7, the words asking him is in the step. Right? Well, step 7 talks about asking him. And that's prayer. Whenever the big book talks about asking, it's about prayer. So 6 and 7 are not passive, magical, and impractical. This is the popular belief. Most people think that 6 and 7 are a waste of time. They're passive, magical, and impractical. They are exactly the opposite. They are active, effortful, and pragmatic. And this is pragmatic spirituality. AA is asked here in step 6 and 7 to guard against selfish and dishonest words and deeds. AA prays to God or higher power for courage, prays to God for strength to resist the desire to give action to wrong thinking rooted in impure motives. Well, I think this is probably what many religions are trying to do and have been for thousands of years. 6 and 7 ask the AA to use God's power and the power of human free will to abstain from acting out on stinking thinking. I think it's really interesting that what AA is asking the AAs to do is abstain not from alcohol, but to abstain from acting out on stinking thinking. Don't give in to the desire to cheat, lie, be dishonest, be cowardice. Because this is driving a wedge between you and God. And it's causing suffering for you and the people around you. Ask the AA not to give in to temptations to lie, cheat, steal, misrepresent the truth, or think only of one's own welfare. So the AA becomes hyper-vigilant. You know, am I cheating? Am I stealing? Am I misrepresenting the truth? Am I thinking only of my own welfare? So we're talking about exercising the choice not to act on urges. And this requires daily vigilance. And that's what the 10th step is all about. It's really daily vigilance of 6, 7, and 4 and 5. So this practice is thought to build moral muscle, if you like the term moral muscle, and you can see that image. The practice of 6 and 7 is also called denying the self. You might be familiar with that term. Or turning away from the self. You might be familiar with that. Or you might be familiar with dying to self. Or you might be familiar with the word repenting, which is just turning away. It's just not doing, the wrong thing. When you repent, you just stop doing the wrong thing. So we're talking vigilant awareness and self-monitoring in 6 and 7. And this is vigilant awareness of one's motives. There's always this questioning going on. Why do I want to say that? Why do I want to do that? Am I self-seeking? Am I being inconsiderate? Am I misrepresenting the truth? Am I being cowardice? So the AA might ask the following. As they're going on, in the big book, there are actually questions that are asked. And if you have a good sponsor, the sponsor will say, did you ask yourself these questions today? When you talk to the sponsor on the phone. Or if you see them, face to face. So the AA in recovery might ask, would this be right? Before they say and do something. Would this be honest? They would say before they say and do something. Would this benefit others? So 6 and 7, I think, are really practical. Spirituality is subtraction. This is a term that I stole from Joe McQuaney in his little book, The Steps We Took. I've always had this idea in the back of my head about this paradoxical growth through subtraction. But he actually used the term, and he cites Meister Eckhart, 14th century Christian mystic, who said, it is said nature abhors a vacuum. I tell you God abhors a vacuum. So empty yourself of self, and you automatically fill with God. Joe McQuaney's citing it. It's not in any of the AA-approved literature. It's not in the big book. It's not in the 12 and 12. But it sort of fits with what AA is saying. The metaphor of if you want to put new furniture in this house, when I get all new furniture in all the rooms, what's the first thing you have to do? You have to empty out the old and discard it. So again, that metaphor is used. In fact, that metaphor is used by Joe and Charlie when they go around on the speaking circuit doing their big book workshops. So there is subtraction going on, and then there's substitution going on. As fear and cowardice is diminished, courage fills the vacuum. This is AA thinking. As egocentric lack of consideration for others is diminished, wisdom fills in the vacuum. Wisdom being thinking that considers multiple perspectives, not just the self. As prideful efforts to please a vain sense of personal identity is diminished, humility fills the vacuum. So you see this coin again with two sides. As the one diminishes, the other builds up. 8 and 9. We continue to do what we previously decided we would do. We decided in step 3 that we would seek a spiritual solution, and we're taking the action in 6 and 7, and now we're taking more action in 8 and 9. So what is 8? Made a list of all persons we had harmed and became willing to make amends to them all. And 9, made direct amends to such people wherever possible, except when to do so would injure them or others. So the AA's big book describes how right living has 3 spheres. Right relationship with God, we talked about that. We talked about right relationship with self and right relationship with others. While 8 and 9 are obviously about the latter. Sobriety is concerned with achieving harmony in all 3 spheres, right? Which is different than abstinence. You're not going to develop right relationship with God, self, and others just by putting a plug in the jug and not physically consuming alcohol. So 8 and 9 seek to repair damaged relationships and undo or heal or reduce other people's suffering. So I'm thinking about undoing other people's suffering. I'm thinking about healing other people's suffering or reducing other people's suffering. Right? So what you're doing here is you are flexing the moral muscle of concern for others. You have historically been concerned with only number 1. So this is a shift in one's underlying motives. So 8 and 9. Step 8 asks the AA to become willing to right the wrongs they have perpetrated because of untreated alcoholism. And AA talks about untreated alcoholism as these character defects running riot. Unbridled deceit and dishonesty. Unbridled cowardice. That's untreated alcoholism. Again, it's not the alcohol that they're so much concerned with, it's what comes after alcohol. I, self, and the me. That's what needs to be treated. Big Book provides techniques for how to facilitate willingness and motivation. Again, more willingness, more motivation. This is a theme that you can see. Big Book believes social harmony is God's will. I think most people would agree with that. Disharmony and conflict are barriers to peace and serenity, both at the societal level and at the intrapersonal level, in terms of guilt, motivation, shame, anger, interpersonal hostility. Righting wrongs also purges or empties the self of anger, or purges or empties self of fear, guilt, which lowers the barrier that blocks God consciousness. Once all of these old furniture is removed out of the building, then God can put his or her furniture in there. A's work step 9 with a sponsor, being careful not to perpetrate yet more harm on others. The idea is not to go to others and risk harming them more. Saying, "I'm sorry, please forgive me," is not a proper restitution. So this is not something that is done on a glib basis or glossed over. While the AA does not explicitly ask forgiveness when they approach another person, it is often obtained. The AA may receive it from others, and they may sense God's forgiveness, a sense of personal well-being due to less emotional burden linked to feelings that other people and God are no longer angry and seeking revenge. Certainly one of the reasons for the fear is that you have harmed these people and that they're out to get you. And if you can right the wrong, then the fear is going to dissipate. So there are some personal benefits that include a sense of belonging. This alienation, this hostility-based alienation tends to melt away. Sense of serenity is a personal benefit. Gratitude, humility, peace of mind, contentment, clear conscience, sleep good at night, loss of fear of retribution, increased sense of safety in the world. I don't mean physical safety necessarily, it's more of an existential kind of a safety. Of course, this is not about benefits to the self. 8 and 9 are not about benefits to the self. 8 and 9 are about benefiting the others. It's about social concern. But there are side spin-off effects that benefit the self. Step 10, again here, we just continue to do what we previously decided we would do, except every day, morning, noon, and night. This is done every day, morning, noon, and night. And if you go through this book, which is for the Recovering AA, there's actually a chart, and that you actually fill it out in the morning, noon, and night. And there are questions in the big book on what you should say to yourself just before you go to bed. You ask yourself a number of questions, then you meditate and reflect on those questions. Basically, it's how in tune with the moral compass was I today? You know, was I was I dishonest? And then you think. You know, was I inconsiderate? And then you think. So this is the daily. Step 10 is doing 1 to 9, but you do a mini inventory. Continue to take personal inventory, and when we were wrong, promptly admitted it. You've already done the big inventory, right? The step 4 inventory. That's the big one. And then you've confessed or you've disclosed that to your sponsor. But here you're doing one every day. But these are just little ones for today. The big 4th step inventory is a lifetime inventory. And you've harmed a lot of people in your life. These AAs certainly have. But here you're just talking about, okay, we got a clean slate. All right? I'm current. But I've been awake now for 10 hours. Maybe I've harmed some other people, since I woke up this morning. So it's on a daily basis, you do an inventory for just that waking period that day, and then the next day you do it again. So that's what the 10th step is. Continued. It's a continual mini inventory over a shorter period of time. And when you're promptly admitted it, right away, not 2 weeks later, but it's like, you remember, oh, I shouldn't have said that. 3 hours ago I said something to, this person. And then you go to them and so this is working steps 1 through 9 on a daily basis, I was just saying. Morning inventory, spot check inventory during the day, evening review inventory. So you're not going to accumulate a lot of new guilt. You're not going to accumulate a lot of new shame and backlog lots of new fears and lots of new resentments. I mean, you're going to be pretty pure, pretty empty of these liabilities, which will enable you to hear the still small voice that some people think is God. Steps 11 and 12, sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God as we understood Him, praying only for knowledge of His will for us, and the power to carry it out. By the way, it doesn't say praying only that God give me my way, which is what most people do, is they ask God, please have my will done. It's not about getting your way, it's asking God for knowledge of what He wants, not telling Him what you want. I mean, it's completely different than most people pray. And then having the power and the courage to carry it out once you understand what God wants you to do, which is usually to be honest, to be considerate of others, don't lie, cheat, steal, show courage, be virtuous. Well, that's a hard thing to do, so you need help. So you ask for help, you ask for strength to carry out and courage to carry it out. And step 12, having had a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps, we tried to carry this message to alcoholics and to practice these principles in all our affairs. Well, having had a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps, what steps? These prior 11 steps. See, step 12 is not really a step, it's a consequence of doing the first 11. Having had a spiritual, we tried to carry this message. Again, we talked about what is the message. The message is that you can't, God can, let him. I mean, that's really the message. I can't, he can, I'll let him. We've got less than a minute, so let me just wrap this up with, this is a good way to wrap it up, because we have an intermission. Let's see what we have here. So I want to thank you in advance for sitting for all this 3 hours. I appreciate you coming back. Here's the City of Vancouver approved radar trap. That looks more like Michigan to me. I don't. Yeah. Here's. Yeah, that's lots of bathrooms. Somebody's been creative. I had to burst out laughing when I saw that. Don't misunderstand me. I'm not anti-religious. All right. Well, thank you very much for listening, and I appreciate the invitation to come. Thank you for listening. I have this.